My name is Aria Mooncrest. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, capable, and low maintenance. I'm the kind of person people trust with keys, passwords, and secrets, but rarely ask how I'm doing beyond that. I work a professional job that looks ordinary from the outside. I live in a city where everyone is busy, polite, and quietly exhausted. And for a long time, I believed that being dependable was the same thing as being valued. People often underestimate me because I don't compete for attention. I don't raise my voice. I don't narrate my pain in real time. If there's tension in a room, I'm usually the one smoothing it over, making sure things keep moving. That calm gets mistaken for compliance. That silence gets mistaken for absence. And that misunderstanding is where this story begins. This isn't a story about revenge. There are no villains twirling, no dramatic confrontations where someone storms out and slams a door. What I'm sharing with you is quieter than that, and I think more honest. It's the story of what happens when a partnership exists in name, not in feeling. When you are married but emotionally alone. When you slowly realize that the life you're maintaining is built on your presence, yet your inner world has gone largely unnoticed. Over the next hour or so, I'll walk you through an emotional journey that unfolded over years, not weeks. You'll hear about the small moments that didn't seem important at the time, the ways to explain things away, the role I accepted without ever formally agreeing to it, and then the moment, soft, almost unremarkable, when something inside me shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but permanently. What follows is not about dramatic exits or public victories. It's about quiet dominance, the kind that comes from clarity rather than force. From choosing silence not as surrender, but as intention. From preparing carefully while being underestimated. And from walking away internally long before anything changed on the surface. I'm telling this story because I know how lonely this particular kind of loneliness can be. The kind where nothing is technically wrong, so you feel unjustified for feeling empty. Where you are appreciated for what you provide, but not truly known. Where you keep thinking, if I just explain better, if I'm more patient, if I ask less, things will eventually balance out. This is a documentary style account of how I stopped waiting for that balance and what happened after. I won't exaggerate events or paint myself as flawless. I'll tell you what I noticed, what I ignored, and what I learned when I finally listened to the part of myself I had been quieting for years. If you've ever been seen as strong when you were actually just silent, if you've ever wondered whether your absence would even be felt, let me ask you gently. Have you ever been in a relationship where you were present every day but felt emotionally alone? I used to think being easy to be with was a virtue that would eventually be noticed. Not praised loudly, maybe, but felt. I believed that if I stayed consistent, if I showed up, kept things running, absorbed stress quietly, someone, somewhere in the relationship would recognize the weight of that constancy. Instead, it became invisible and then expected. To them, I was the reliable one, the steady presence, the person who remembered dates, handled logistics, smoothed conversations, and made uncomfortable moments disappear before they became problems. I was the emotional infrastructure of the relationship, not the centerpiece, more like the wiring behind the walls, essential but unseen. And once something becomes unseen long enough, people forget it can ever be removed. I wasn't treated badly in any obvious way. That's important to say. There was no cruelty, no dramatic neglect, no clear line I could point to and say, that's when it became wrong. On the surface, everything looked functional. We had routines, we shared responsibilities, we made decisions together. Or at least it looked that way. If someone asked how things were, I'd say, we're good. And I meant it in the narrow, practical sense of the word. But emotionally, I had begun to occupy a very specific role. I was the listener, not the one listened to. The supporter, not the one supported. My thoughts were acknowledged politely and then overridden gently. My feelings were met with solutions instead of curiosity. Over time, I learned that bringing up discomfort only slowed things down. And since I was good at keeping things moving, I stopped. They often describe me as strong. I wore that word like a badge for a while. Strength sounded like respect. It sounded like trust. But what it really meant was that I didn't require much emotional maintenance. I didn't unravel. I didn't demand space. I didn't disrupt plans with inconvenient needs. My strength made me efficient to love, but not necessarily to understand. In group settings, I faded into the background without anyone pushing me there. I let others speak first. I filled in gaps when needed. I noticed details no one else tracked. And slowly, people stopped asking what I thought unless a decision needed to be finalized. I wasn't part of the exploration, just the confirmation, the quiet nod that made everything official. At home, this dynamic deepened. My marriage functioned smoothly because I made it smooth. If there was tension, I addressed it internally. If something felt off, I waited for a better time to bring it up. That better time rarely came, and after a while, I stopped looking for it. I told myself this was maturity, compromise, love expressed through restraint. But restraint, when it only moves in one direction, becomes erasure. I became very good at being needed without being missed. If I were present, things worked. If I were quiet, things still worked. And that was the problem. My emotional absence didn't create immediate consequences, so no one noticed it happening, least of all me. I remember realizing much later that no one could have described my inner world at that point. Not even my partner. They knew my preferences, my schedule, and my competencies. But not my doubts, not my fatigue, not the slow dimming that happens when you are constantly adapting yourself to fit the emotional temperature of someone else. And I didn't blame them. That's the strange part. I had trained everyone around me on how to treat me by what I tolerated, what I minimized, and what I carried without comment. I became the version of myself that made other people's lives easier. And in doing so, I disappeared just enough to stop being fully seen. At the time, I didn't call it loneliness. I called it stability, responsibility, adulthood. I told myself this was what a long-term partnership looked like. Less intensity, more efficiency. Less emotion, more coordination. I was married after all. I had a role, a title, a place. But inside, something was quietly wrong. Not broken, just unacknowledged. And that unacknowledged space would become important later. Because what goes unseen for too long doesn't vanish. It waits. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic shift in tone. Just a moment so small that if I hadn't been paying attention to how my body reacted, I would have forgotten it entirely. That's how these things begin. Not with a wound, but with a barely visible scratch. We were talking about a decision that affected both of us. Nothing monumental. One of those everyday choices that quietly reveals how power is distributed in a relationship. I shared my perspective carefully, the way I always did, measured, reasonable, already softened to avoid friction. I remember pausing, waiting for the response, expecting at least a question. Instead, it was dismissed. Not harshly, not even consciously. My partner smiled, said something like, "That's not really how it works," and moved on, just like that. The conversation continued, but without me in it. Everyone else in the room kept talking. No one noticed the pause that lingered inside my chest. No one saw the moment where I recalibrated, where I quietly told myself, "It's fine. They didn't mean it like that." I nodded, adjusted my expression, and rejoined the flow. From the outside, nothing had changed, but I remembered it. Not because it hurt dramatically, but because it revealed something. It showed me how easily my voice could be set aside without consequence, how smoothly the system kept running when my input was treated as optional, and how quickly I learned to adapt to that. Later that night, I replayed the moment in my head, not obsessively, just enough to analyze it from every angle. I asked myself if I'd been unclear, if my timing was off, if I'd been too sensitive. I found reasons to excuse it because that felt safer than acknowledging the alternative. The alternative was this: my perspective wasn't weighted the same as theirs. And once you notice that imbalance, you start seeing echoes of it everywhere. I began to catch the subtle patterns, how my suggestions were acknowledged only when they aligned with what was already decided, how my concerns were reframed as inconveniences, how my emotional reactions were treated as things to manage rather than signals to understand. Still, I didn't speak up. Not because I lacked the words, but because I understood the cost. Speaking up meant disrupting the peace. It meant being labeled difficult, emotional, or overthinking. And I had spent years cultivating the opposite reputation. I was the calm one, the rational one, the one who didn't make things harder than they needed to be. So I stayed quiet. I filed the moment away in a mental drawer labeled "probably nothing." I told myself that long-term relationships required flexibility, that love wasn't about winning every conversation, that this was just one of those minor misalignments that didn't deserve attention. But the body remembers what the mind tries to minimize. I noticed how my shoulders tensed slightly the next time I spoke, how I pre-edited my thoughts more aggressively, how I waited longer for pauses that invited me in, pauses that didn't come. I became more efficient with my words, trimming them down to what felt least interruptive. No one commented on the change. From their perspective, I was the same as always. Still supportive, still present, still agreeable. If anything, I was easier to be with, less resistant, less complicated. That was the quiet cost of the first small cut. It didn't bleed outward. It didn't demand care. It healed over quickly, but it healed wrong. And it taught me something dangerous, that disappearing slightly made everything run smoother. I didn't know then that this moment would matter. I didn't mark it as a turning point. I just felt a subtle shift, like a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, even though no one acknowledged it had ever been there. That's how invisibility grows, not through cruelty, but through accumulation, through moments that everyone else forgets and one person remembers. And I remembered. Once you explain something away enough times, it starts to feel normal. After that first small cut, nothing dramatic followed, no escalation, no apology. Life simply continued, and because it continued smoothly, I took that as evidence that my discomfort hadn't mattered, or worse, that it hadn't been real. So I adjusted, quietly, automatically, the way you do when you don't want to be the source of friction. Similar moments began to repeat themselves, each one just subtle enough to dismiss on its own. A comment redirected. A decision was finalized without my input. A joke made at my expense that everyone laughed at, including me, because not laughing would have made it awkward. Individually, none of these moments felt worth addressing. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't yet have language for. I started telling myself a familiar story. This is just how long relationships work. Passion settles, communication becomes more efficient. You don't need to be consulted on everything. I mistook emotional erosion for maturity. I believed that letting things slide was proof of growth, not a sign that something was slipping away. The truth was, I was becoming easier to overlook because I was training everyone around me to do exactly that. Each time I swallowed a reaction, I reinforced the idea that my inner world was optional. Each time I smoothed over discomfort, I made it unnecessary for anyone else to notice it. I became highly skilled at self-editing, anticipating which thoughts would be welcomed and which would quietly derail the mood. What I didn't realize was how much energy that took. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from constant emotional management. Not the dramatic kind, but the low-grade fatigue of always monitoring yourself. I felt it in the way my enthusiasm dulled, in how I spoke less during conversations I once enjoyed. I began to feel like a background character in my own life. Still, I defended the dynamic. If a friend hinted that I seemed quieter, I brushed it off. If my partner didn't notice my withdrawal, I told myself that meant things were stable. I was proud of not needing much, proud of being adaptable, proud of being the one who didn't make things a big deal. But not making things a big deal has consequences. Disrespect, when it's subtle, thrives on silence. It doesn't announce itself. It seeps in slowly, normalized by routine and politeness. And because I wasn't being overtly mistreated, I felt I had no right to name what was happening. I couldn't point to a single offense, only a growing sense of being unconsidered. There were moments I almost spoke up. I could feel the words forming, the gentle but honest way I might express myself. But then I'd imagine the response, the confusion, the defensiveness. The well-meaning explanations would frame my feelings as misunderstandings, and I'd decide it wasn't worth the emotional labor. So I stayed quiet, and my quiet was misinterpreted as consent. The role I was sliding into wasn't assigned in one conversation. It emerged through repetition. Every time I chose peace over presence, every time I told myself that being easy to love mattered more than being fully seen. By the time I noticed how lopsided things had become, the imbalance felt established. Questioning it now seemed disruptive, almost unreasonable. After all, nothing was wrong. We were functioning. We were married. We were fine. Except I wasn't. I felt smaller. Not in confidence, but in visibility. Like my edges had been softened so much that I no longer took up space. And the most unsettling part was this. No one had asked me to do that. I had done it myself, in the name of harmony. That realization lingered quietly, just beneath the surface of my daily life. I didn't act on it yet. I wasn't ready. But something in me had begun to notice the cost of staying silent. And once you notice that, it becomes harder to ignore. I didn't wake up one day and realize I had been assigned a role. It revealed itself slowly, through expectation rather than instruction. No one sat me down and said, "This is who you are to us now." Instead, they reacted positively every time I fulfilled a certain function. And over time, those reactions shaped the boundaries of who I was allowed to be. I was the reliable one, the emotionally regulated one, the person who didn't take things personally. If there was a problem, I was expected to handle it calmly. If there was tension, I was expected to diffuse it. If someone else was stressed, I was expected to understand. That expectation wasn't enforced with pressure. It was reinforced with relief. Things went smoother when I stayed in my lane. And I did. I began to notice that my value in the relationship was tied to how useful I was, not how present I felt. I was praised for being low drama, for being practical, for not needing reassurance. Those compliments felt good at first. They sounded like trust, but they also came with an unspoken condition: don't change. Anytime I stepped slightly outside the role, expressed hurt, needed more time, questioned a decision, the atmosphere shifted, not aggressively, just enough to signal that I was disrupting something. Conversations became tighter, explanations more logical. Feelings were acknowledged in theory, but redirected in practice. So I learned the boundaries. I learned which versions of myself were welcomed and which ones made people uncomfortable. I learned that my competence was appreciated, but my vulnerability created inconvenience. And because I cared about the stability of my marriage, I chose competence over and over again. What I didn't see then was how one-sided that choice had become. In healthy partnerships, roles are flexible. They adjust as people grow. But mine had hardened without my consent. I was the anchor, the planner, the emotional buffer. Not the one who got anchored, not the one whose emotions set the pace. My job was to adapt, not to be adapted to. The strange thing is, no one was consciously taking advantage of this. They were simply responding to the version of me that showed up most consistently, the one who made things easier, the one who didn't ask for much. And because I delivered that version so well, it became the only one they expected. At some point, I realized something unsettling. If I stopped performing this role, things would wobble. Not because I was controlling the relationship, but because I was holding it up. And that knowledge kept me in place longer than I care to admit. I told myself this was a responsibility, that someone had to be the steady one, that love meant carrying more when the other person couldn't. But I had stopped asking whether the load was ever meant to be this uneven. Inside, I felt a quiet resistance building, not anger, not resentment, just a growing awareness that I had been reduced to a function, reliable, useful, invisible. And once you see the role you've been assigned, you face a choice: continue playing it or begin silently to step out of it. I didn't announce that choice. I didn't even fully understand it yet. But something in me was preparing, not for confrontation, but for change, the kind that doesn't ask permission. There was no argument that day, no revelation delivered in a sharp sentence, no moment where I finally stood up for myself. In fact, if you had been watching from the outside, you wouldn't have noticed anything at all. But inside me, something changed. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in the middle of an ordinary routine. We were talking about plans, future-oriented, practical, already half-decided. I was listening, nodding, and contributing where expected. And suddenly, I became aware of a strange distance between my words and my feelings, like I was participating from memory, not presence. I heard myself agreeing to something I hadn't actually chosen. That awareness landed softly, but it stayed. I noticed how automatic my responses had become, how quickly I adjusted myself to fit the direction things were already going. And for the first time, instead of explaining it away, I simply observed it. There was no spike of emotion, no anger, just clarity. I realized that I had been emotionally negotiating from a position I never agreed to occupy. I was constantly adapting, anticipating, smoothing, but not being met in the same way. And the most important realization followed right after. No one was going to notice this unless I changed something. Not them, me. That afternoon, I went for a walk alone. No music, no podcast, just space. And in that quiet, I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. What would happen if I stopped compensating? The answer wasn't dramatic, it was unsettling. Things would feel awkward. Someone else would feel the weight I'd been carrying. Decisions would take longer. Emotions might surface without being pre-managed. The system would wobble, not collapse, but reveal its imbalance. And instead of fearing that, I felt calm. That was the shift. I didn't decide to leave. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't even label what I was feeling as dissatisfaction. I simply stopped lying to myself about the cost of my silence. I acknowledged that being emotionally alone inside a marriage was not a personal failure. It was information. That evening, nothing changed outwardly. Dinner was made, conversation flowed, routines held, but internally, I withdrew something subtle, my automatic self-erasure. I began listening differently, not to respond, but to understand what was actually being said and what wasn't. I noticed assumptions. I noticed how often my agreement was treated as a default, and instead of correcting it, I took note. This wasn't detachment born of bitterness. It was awareness without urgency. I didn't feel the need to fix anything immediately. I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to see clearly. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to consider that my inner life mattered, even if no one else was prioritizing it. That my quiet didn't obligate me to keep absorbing discomfort. That I could choose when and how to engage. That day didn't end with a decision. It ended with a boundary, internal, invisible, but firm. A line I wouldn't cross again without noticing. And once that line existed, everything that followed began to reorganize itself around it. After that day, my silence changed in quality. Before, it had been reflexive, a way to keep things smooth, to avoid disruption, to maintain the role I had been assigned. Now, it has become intentional, not cold, not passive-aggressive, just chosen. And that difference mattered more than I expected. I stopped volunteering explanations. I stopped preemptively fixing emotional discomfort that wasn't mine to manage. When conversations drifted past my input, I let them. When decisions were made quickly, I observed that instead of adjusting myself to catch up, I didn't withdraw, I simply didn't compensate. At first, no one noticed. That's the irony of being invisible for so long. When you step back, it takes time for others to realize you're no longer holding the same weight. Things still worked, mostly, but they took more effort, more pauses, more clarification. Those pauses were revealing. I watched how often my partner filled the silence with assumptions instead of questions. How rarely they checked in unless something became inconvenient, and how accustomed they were to my quiet agreement. When it didn't arrive on cue, there was a flicker of confusion, but no curiosity. They mistook my silence for weakness or compliance, or maybe they didn't think about it at all. And that too was information. What I didn't do was confront. I didn't correct misunderstandings in real time. I didn't announce a change. I let the absence of my usual emotional labor speak for itself, not as punishment, but as truth. Inside, something steadied. I had more energy, more attention, not because life was easier, but because I was no longer managing everything in advance. I began directing that energy inward, toward noticing, learning, and recalibrating my own priorities. I paid attention to patterns I had ignored before. How often were my needs treated as negotiable? How easily my boundaries dissolved when they weren't explicitly stated, and how little resistance there was to that dissolution. This wasn't empowering in a dramatic way. It was sobering. I also noticed something else. When you stop explaining yourself, people reveal how much they've been relying on your explanations to avoid accountability. Silence creates a mirror, and not everyone likes what they see in it. There were moments when I could have spoken up, clarified, softened, reassured. Old instincts rose automatically, but I held them back, not out of spite, but out of respect for myself. I needed to see what happened when I didn't manage the narrative. What happened was subtle discomfort, slight misalignments, small inefficiencies, nothing catastrophic, but enough to expose how much emotional smoothing I had been doing behind the scenes. I didn't feel powerful, I felt grounded. This was the beginning of quiet dominance, not over someone else, but over my own participation. I was choosing when to engage, when to step back, and when to simply observe. And in that choice, I reclaimed something essential: agency. No one congratulated me. No one noticed the shift explicitly. But the dynamic had changed. And once silence becomes a choice, it can no longer be used against you. While everything looked the same on the surface, I was paying attention in a way I never had before. I wasn't spying. I wasn't scheming. I was simply present without performing. And that changed what I could see. When you stop filling in the gaps for others, patterns emerge on their own, unfiltered, uncorrected. I noticed how often decisions were framed as mutual after they were already leaning in one direction. How my agreement was assumed, not requested. How my emotional availability was treated as a constant resource rather than a choice. None of this was new, but now I was documenting it mentally instead of absorbing it. I also noticed myself. Without the constant obligation to manage the atmosphere, I had space to think, to read, to learn, to revisit parts of my life I had put on hold because they didn't fit neatly into the role I'd been playing. I started journaling, not about feelings, but about facts, timelines, patterns, moments where my presence was taken for granted. This wasn't preparation for revenge. It was preparation for clarity. There's a difference. Clarity doesn't rush. It doesn't need an audience. It accumulates quietly until decisions become obvious. I began to understand where I stood, not just emotionally, but structurally. What I contributed, what I controlled, what would change if I stepped back further. And here's what they never noticed. I was no longer negotiating my worth in real time. I wasn't seeking validation through cooperation. I was observing the system as it was, not as I hoped it could be. That shift made me quieter, but more anchored. I learned more in those months than I had in years of trying to communicate better. Because communication, without curiosity on the other side becomes performance. And I had stopped performing. They didn't see the late nights I spent reading about emotional labor, relational dynamics, and power that doesn't announce itself. They didn't see me reconnect with parts of myself that had been dormant, interests, ambitions, competencies that had nothing to do with being supportive. They didn't notice the way I started protecting my energy, saying less, sharing selectively, listening without absorbing. I became precise with my attention, and that precision created leverage, not over them, but over my own future. The irony is, from the outside, I look the same. Still calm, still capable, still fine. That's what made it possible. When people underestimate your internal shifts, they don't interfere with them. I wasn't building an exit yet. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was building understanding of myself, of the relationship, of what staying actually meant, and what leaving would require. What they never noticed was that I had already stopped needing them to see me in order to see myself. And once that happens, the balance of power changes, quietly but completely. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush of triumph, no sharp inhale of victory. It arrived the way truth often does, plain, steady, undeniable. I realized that my leverage had never been emotional. It wasn't about withholding affection or creating distance to provoke a reaction. It wasn't about being needed or missed. The leverage was structural, practical, quiet, and it had been there the entire time, unnoticed, because I never framed it as such, even to myself. I saw clearly how much of the life we shared relied on my consistency, not just emotionally, but logistically, financially, administratively. I was the keeper of continuity, the one who remembered, maintained, and anticipated, the one who made sure nothing fell through the cracks. And because I had never named that role, it had been taken for granted. This realization wasn't empowering in a dramatic way. It was sobering. It meant that the relationship functioned not because of mutual attunement, but because I compensated for its absence. And it meant that if I chose differently, the imbalance would surface, not as punishment, but as a consequence. I didn't feel anger, I felt clarity. I understood then that emotional loneliness had trained me to become self-sufficient in ways that went far beyond feelings. I had built systems, safeguards, knowledge. I knew where things were, how they worked, what depended on what. That knowledge wasn't flashy, but it was decisive. This was my private reveal. I wasn't trapped. I had never been trapped. I had simply been too busy holding things together to see the options clearly. I sat with that realization for a long time. I didn't act on it immediately. I needed to be sure I wasn't confusing power with control. I wasn't interested in manipulating outcomes or creating chaos. I wanted alignment, or the freedom to step away without imploding my life. And that required precision. So I kept my observations to myself. I didn't hint. I didn't test reactions. I continued moving calmly, deliberately, as if nothing had changed. Because on the surface, nothing had. The change was internal and irreversible. Knowing where your leverage lies doesn't make you ruthless. It makes you responsible. It asks you to choose carefully, to act cleanly, to avoid unnecessary harm. By the time I finished integrating that truth, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever decision I made next would not be emotional. It would be informed, grounded. And finally, there is a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when indecision ends. Not because something external forces your hand, but because continuing to delay becomes more painful than choosing. That was where I found myself, not at a crossroads marked by drama, but at a narrowing path where only honesty could fit. By then, I wasn't confused anymore. Confusion had dissolved into clarity, and clarity has a weight to it. It presses on you gently but persistently, asking to be acknowledged. I carried that weight for a while, letting it settle, making sure it was real and not just a reaction to temporary fatigue or disappointment. I laid out my options carefully, the way I do with anything that matters. The first option was to stay exactly as I was, to continue being competent, calm, and emotionally alone, to accept that the relationship functioned best when I minimized myself. This option promised stability, familiarity, no disruption. I knew how to survive there. I had already been doing it for years. But survival, I realized, had quietly replaced intimacy, and that trade no longer felt neutral. The second option was to try to renegotiate the relationship openly, to articulate what I had been feeling, to ask for a change. On paper, this sounded reasonable, healthy even. But when I imagined it honestly, without optimism filling in the gaps, I saw the likely outcome. Not cruelty, not dismissal, but confusion, defensiveness disguised as logic, a flurry of explanations that would frame my experience as a misunderstanding rather than a reality. I had already lived that cycle in smaller ways. I knew how it ended, with me explaining myself more clearly, more gently, more patiently, until my original point dissolved into reassurance for someone else. I wasn't afraid of the conversation. I was tired of conversations that went nowhere. The third option was the one I hadn't allowed myself to consider until recently. Not because it was extreme, but because it was definitive. It involved stepping out of the structure entirely, emotionally first, practically next. It meant choosing a future that did not require constant translation of my inner life into something palatable. It meant choosing alignment over accommodation. What made this option different was not its finality, but its integrity. I didn't rush toward it. I examined it slowly, testing my motives. I asked myself whether I was trying to escape discomfort or honor truth, whether I was acting from resentment or from self-respect, whether I would still choose this path if no one ever validated it. Each time the answer was the same, yes. The realization that surprised me most was how little anger I felt. There was sadness, certainly, a quiet grief for what I had hoped the relationship could be, for the version of myself that had waited patiently, believing that effort would eventually be met with curiosity. But there was no bitterness, no desire to punish, just a steady acceptance that something essential had been missing, and that it was not my job to keep pretending otherwise. I thought about time, not in dramatic terms, but in ordinary ones, mornings, evenings. The years stretching ahead are filled with small decisions and unspoken adjustments. I imagined myself 5 years from now, still negotiating my needs internally, still smoothing edges, still being described as strong, and I felt a quiet heaviness settle in my chest. Then I imagined the alternative. Uncertainty, yes, but also honesty, space, the ability to respond instead of adapt, to feel without immediately translating that feeling into something manageable for someone else. That future felt lighter, even with its risks. That was when I understood. The irreversible part of this decision had already happened. I had crossed it the moment I stopped lying to myself about what I needed. Everything after that was just logistics. Once the decision crystallized internally, something else happened, something I hadn't expected. The noise stopped, the constant internal debate, the subtle bargaining, the mental rehearsals of conversations that never quite happened, all of it fell quiet. In its place was a calm sequence of next steps. I didn't feel compelled to act immediately. Urgency is often a sign of emotional overload, and I wasn't overloaded. I was clear. I allowed myself time to prepare, not out of fear, but out of respect for the reality of what I was changing. Lives, after all, are not rearranged cleanly. They require care, even when endings are necessary. I began organizing things quietly, not dramatically, just thoughtfully. I paid attention to details I had once handled automatically and now evaluated deliberately. I asked myself what independence actually required, not in theory, but in practice. What I needed to know, what I needed to secure, what I needed to let go of. Throughout this process, nothing outwardly changed. That's the part people misunderstand about decisive moments. They imagine visible shifts, arguments, declarations, emotional scenes, but the most consequential decisions often happen in silence. They don't announce themselves. They simply reorient everything that follows. I also noticed something else. Once I stopped centering the relationship as the primary reference point for my choices, my sense of self stabilized. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was acting. That distinction matters. Reaction keeps you tethered to the thing you're responding to. Action moves you forward. This decision was not about winning. It was not about being right. It was about refusing to continue a pattern that required my quiet absence in order to function. It was about acknowledging that emotional loneliness, sustained long enough, becomes a form of erosion. And erosion deserves attention, not endurance. By the time I reached the end of this internal process, there was no suspense left. The choice felt settled, like a door that had closed gently but firmly. I didn't need anyone else to agree with it. I didn't need it to be understood immediately. I just needed to honor it. And I did. From that point on, everything I did, every step, every preparation, every silence, was guided by that alignment. The decision was made, not in anger, not in haste, but with a clarity that left no room for return. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to the world. Explanation, I had learned, invites negotiation. And this phase of my life required precision, not persuasion. I moved in silence, not secretively, but deliberately. There's a difference. Secrecy hides out of fear. Silence protects out of clarity. On the surface, nothing changed. Our routines held. Conversations stayed polite, even warm. If anything, I seemed more composed than before. That was because the internal debate was over. When doubt leaves, calm often takes its place. Behind that calm, I began attending to practical realities. Not dramatically, not urgently, just steadily. I reviewed documents I had previously managed without question. I educated myself on processes I had once assumed would always be shared. I paid attention to timelines, obligations, and dependencies. This wasn't about preparing an escape. It was about restoring balance to my own life. I started separating what I had been carrying automatically from what I actually needed to carry going forward. Tasks I once handled by default, I now evaluate consciously. Some I continued, others I let rest, just long enough to see who noticed. Very few did. That told me more than any conversation could have. I also became intentional with my energy. I stopped offering emotional availability on demand. Not coldly, but selectively. If I were asked how I felt, I answered honestly but briefly. If I wasn't asked, I didn't volunteer. I was no longer auditioning for understanding. Externally, this read as stability. Internally, it was a reallocation. I sought information, not reassurance. I spoke to professionals when needed, not friends. I wanted facts, frameworks, options, not opinions shaped by loyalty or fear. This phase required clear eyes. There was a particular kind of dignity in this process. No dramatics, no declarations, just quiet steps taken in alignment with a truth I had already accepted. My partner didn't notice, not because they were careless, but because the system had trained them not to. My consistency had always been the background condition, and as long as that background appeared unchanged, there was no reason to look closer. I wasn't angry about that, I was observant. Each small action, each document reviewed, each boundary quietly held, felt like reclaiming territory I had once abandoned without realizing it. Not territory over someone else, but over my own life. This is what people misunderstand about moving in silence. It's not about deception. It's about allowing reality to reveal itself without interference. If something only functions when you constantly hold it together, letting go, even slightly, tells you everything you need to know. By the time this phase was complete, I was no longer emotionally entangled in outcomes. I wasn't hoping for a wake-up call. I wasn't waiting to be chosen differently. I was ready, calmly, cleanly, for whatever came next. And something did come next. Not all at once, but enough to shift the atmosphere in ways that could no longer be ignored. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They emerge as absences, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. What changed wasn't the presence of conflict, but the disappearance of something that had always been there, quietly compensating. Small things started slipping. Appointments needed confirmation. Decisions stalled longer than expected. Emotional cues went unanswered. Not dramatically, just enough to create friction where there had once been flow. I noticed it immediately. Others felt it before they understood it. At first, the confusion showed up as irritation directed at the situation, not at me. Schedules felt heavier. Conversations felt less efficient. There was a sense that something was off, though no one could quite name it. And because I wasn't stepping in to smooth it over, the discomfort lingered. My partner began to feel the loss before recognizing its source. Questions came later than usual. Clarifications were asked that hadn't been necessary before. I could see the system straining slightly under the weight it had never acknowledged. What struck me most was how impersonal it felt from their side. The frustration wasn't about missing me. It was about missing what I provided. The seamlessness, the emotional buffering, the quiet maintenance that made everything feel easy. That distinction mattered. I didn't react. I didn't step back into old habits to relieve the tension. I let it exist, not as punishment, but as information. If the relationship depended on my constant compensation, then its imbalance deserved to be felt. There were moments of subtle recalibration, attempts to restore the old rhythm without naming what had changed. Politeness layered over confusion, efficiency replacing intimacy. Still, no one asked the question that mattered. "How are you?" And I noticed something else. Without my usual emotional labor, my partner seemed unsettled, not angry, just disoriented. They were accustomed to a certain ease. When that ease disappeared, they reached for solutions instead of connection. The consequences continued to unfold quietly. Plans became less certain. Decisions required more negotiation. Emotional moments lingered longer without resolution. The environment grew heavier, not because of conflict, but because the invisible support had been withdrawn. Through all of this, I remained calm, not detached, but grounded. I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement. I was observing whether curiosity would emerge when comfort was removed. It didn't. That absence of curiosity was its own answer. What was happening now wasn't collapse. It was exposure. The relationship was being asked to function without the unseen scaffolding I had provided for years. And without that scaffolding, the limitations became visible. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt certain. Because when consequences begin and nothing meaningful shifts in response, you know you are no longer dealing with a misunderstanding. You are dealing with a structure that cannot or will not change. By the time concern finally surfaced, the ground had already shifted. It didn't arrive as a heartfelt question or a moment of self-reflection. It came as unease, as restlessness, as a growing sense that something essential was no longer where it used to be. And because it hadn't been named early, it now lacked the language to be addressed properly. My partner began to notice the distance, but framed it as a phase, stress, timing, external pressure. They searched for causes that didn't require examining the structure of the relationship itself. Suggestions were made, small adjustments offered. None of them reached the core. That's the danger of waiting too long to look closely. By the time you do, you're already behind the truth. There were attempts to re-engage me in familiar ways, invitations that assumed availability, conversations that circled logistics instead of meaning, a renewed politeness that felt procedural rather than curious. It was effort, but not attunement, and I could feel the gap widening, not because they weren't trying at all, but because they were trying to restore comfort, not connection. They wanted things to feel easy again. What they didn't ask was why ease had come at the cost of my presence. I noticed the shift in tone, a subtle urgency, a hint of panic beneath the surface calm. But still no one asked the question that might have mattered months earlier. No one paused long enough to listen without defending. At this stage, even genuine concern would have arrived too late, not out of punishment, but because clarity had already done its work. I wasn't waiting to be convinced anymore. I wasn't hoping for a different outcome. I had already stepped out of the emotional negotiation. What remained was logistics and timing. I felt a quiet sadness then. Not sharp, not dramatic. Just the weight of recognizing that repair requires willingness on both sides. And timing is part of willingness. You can't undo years of imbalance with sudden attentiveness once the other person has already reorganized themselves around the truth. I didn't reject the efforts that were made. I acknowledged them politely. But I didn't re-enter the role. I didn't resume the emotional labor. I stayed where I was, steady, observant, no longer persuadable. This is the part people misunderstand. They think endings happen when someone stops caring. In reality, many endings happen after someone has cared deeply for a very long time and finally stopped negotiating their worth. By the time the idea of fixing it appeared, I had already accepted that the version of the relationship being repaired was one I could no longer inhabit. And that acceptance made the next step inevitable. The conversation happened on an ordinary evening, no build-up, no dramatic timing. Just a quiet pause in the routine where it became clear that avoiding the truth would require more effort than facing it. I didn't initiate it with an accusation. I didn't arrive armed with examples or rehearsed lines. When the moment came, it felt almost neutral, like stating something that had already been true for a while. We sat across from each other, and for the first time in years, I didn't adjust my words to soften the landing. I spoke calmly, slowly, not to persuade, but to be accurate. I said that I had been lonely for a long time. Not alone, lonely. That the partnership had continued in form, but not in feeling. That I had carried more than my share of the emotional weight, quietly, because it seemed easier than asking for something that never quite arrived. There was no anger in my voice. That surprised them. They listened, at least initially. I could see the effort it took to stay present without interrupting. When they responded, it was measured, confused even. They spoke about intentions, about not realizing, about how things hadn't seemed that bad. And I believed them. That was the strange part. I didn't doubt their sincerity. I doubted the structure that had made my absence invisible. I said as much. I explained that harm doesn't require intent, that loneliness doesn't need permission to exist. The conversation stayed calm because I wasn't asking for change anymore. I was explaining a decision that had already been made internally, and that removed the tension that usually fuels arguments. They asked what I wanted now. I told them the truth. I wanted alignment, and I no longer believed it could be built from where we were standing. That landed heavily. There was a pause, longer this time, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but searching. They tried to respond with solutions, counseling, adjustments, new effort. All reasonable, all late. I listened without dismissing them. And then I said something that surprised even me. I don't doubt that you could try. I doubt that I could go back. That was the moment the conversation changed. Not emotionally, structurally. They realized this wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a plea. It was an explanation. And explanations don't require agreement to be true. There were questions, some defense, some genuinely curious. I answered what I could without over-explaining. I didn't list grievances. I didn't relive every small cut. I focused on patterns, not incidents. On erosion, not explosions. I told them I had stopped wanting to be understood at the cost of understanding myself. That I had spent too long translating my needs into something manageable. That I wasn't angry, but I was done minimizing. The calm unsettled them more than anger would have. Anger invites rebuttal. Calm invites reckoning. They asked if there was someone else. I said no. They asked if this had happened suddenly. I said no again. And that answer carried years in it. They asked why I hadn't said something sooner. I paused before answering that one. Then I said, I did, just not loudly. And eventually, I listened to what your silence was telling me. That was the closest I came to confrontation. The conversation ended without resolution. Not because it failed, but because it wasn't meant to resolve anything. It was meant to mark a boundary, to name what had already shifted, to allow the truth to exist without being argued into a different shape. When it was over, I didn't feel relief. I felt stillness. Not emptiness, not triumph, just the quiet certainty that I had spoken from alignment, not reaction. that whatever came next would be built on honesty, not endurance. And that mattered more than being in agreement. I'm quieter now, but not smaller. For a long time, I believed that finding my voice meant speaking more, explaining better, insisting harder. What I learned instead is that voice begins with self-alignment, with knowing when something no longer fits, and refusing to keep wearing it out of habit. I no longer measure my worth by how easy I am to be with. I don't translate my needs into something more convenient for others. I don't volunteer my emotional labor unless it's met with reciprocity. This isn't hardness, it's precision. My life looks simpler from the outside, fewer explanations, fewer adjustments, more space. I move through my days with a sense of internal coherence I didn't realize I had been missing. Decisions no longer require me to disappear first. I'm not bitter. That surprises people who expect endings to come with sharp edges. I don't need anyone to be the villain of my story. I understand how dynamics form, how roles solidify, how good intentions can coexist with neglect. Understanding doesn't mean accepting. What I carry now is discernment. I notice how people listen, how they respond to boundaries, how they handle silence. I pay attention to whether curiosity appears when comfort is removed, and I trust what I see. The part of me that once waited to be chosen has softened into something steadier. I choose myself first, not in isolation, but in integrity. That has changed the way I show up everywhere else. I am still calm, still capable, still reliable. But those traits are no longer available by default. They are offered selectively, where they are seen and valued, where partnership exists not just in name, but in feeling. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can walk away from what doesn't honor you and still remain kind, still grounded, still open. That is who I am now. For a long time, I thought the hardest part of my story was being emotionally alone inside a marriage. I thought the loneliness itself was the wound. But looking back now, I understand that the deeper pain came from something else entirely. The slow, quiet habit of explaining my absence as maturity. I wasn't abandoned. I wasn't mistreated in obvious ways. I was simply accommodated. An accommodation without curiosity becomes erasure. When a partnership exists in name, not in feeling, it can survive for years without ever being alive. The moral of the story isn't that silence is powerful or that leaving is the answer. It's that endurance is not the same as love, and stability is not the same as connection. You can be strong and still be lonely. You can be reliable and still be unseen. And if you never question that, the cost compounds quietly. Quiet dominance, as I've come to understand it, has nothing to do with control over another person. It's about control over your participation, about recognizing when your presence is being used as a foundation rather than honored as a person, about knowing that you don't have to collapse a structure to step out of it. You only have to stop holding it up. There was no revenge in my leaving, no dramatic justice. The only reversal that mattered was internal. I stopped negotiating my worth. I stopped mistaking silence for peace. I stopped waiting for someone else to notice what I had been carrying all along. If this story resonates, I want you to hear this clearly. Emotional loneliness doesn't require permission to be valid. You don't need a catastrophic event to justify change. You don't need to prove that your pain is loud enough to matter. If something has been quietly eroding you for years, that truth deserves your attention. Sometimes the most honest ending isn't explosive. It's calm, it's clean. It's choosing alignment over endurance and walking forward without needing to be understood by everyone you leave behind. I didn't lose myself when I stepped away. I found myself right where I had been waiting all along. So I'll leave you with this question, and I invite you to answer it in the comments if you feel ready. Have you ever stayed quiet for so long in a relationship that you almost forgot what it felt like to be fully seen? And if so, what finally made you notice?